It was a quiet morning when Sister Mary Agnes walked hand in hand with two small orphans toward the chapel, a ritual as ordinary as breathing in this forgotten corner of the countryside. Locals still remember the way she always knelt with the children before the old wooden altar, whispering prayers meant not just for protection, but for belonging. But what happened that day turned an ordinary ritual into an unspeakable mystery. Without warning, without a single sound, Sister Mary and the two children vanished, right from within the walls of that sacred chapel. There were no broken doors, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Parishioners arrived later that afternoon, expecting the usual silence of prayer, only to find something far more terrifying. The chapel stood undisturbed, candles still burning, hymn books still open, but the three souls who had entered that morning were simply gone. And in that void, something far heavier than fear took hold. A silence that felt like it didn't belong to this world. A silence that carried a question no one could answer. How can someone vanish inside a house of God and never be found? Search parties scoured the surrounding woods. Police investigated every inch of the chapel's foundation. For weeks, volunteers from nearby towns camped outside, hoping, praying for a sign. But days became weeks. Weeks turned into months. And eventually, the faces of Sister Mary and the two children faded from posters and headlines, but not from memory. For 30 long years, the question never left, and neither did the feeling, the eerie sense that the chapel itself was holding a secret, something deeper, something darker. And then it happened. During a routine renovation, workers beneath the chapel floor heard something strange, a hollow echo where there should have been solid earth. Within hours, the unthinkable was uncovered. A tunnel, hidden, sealed, as though someone, or something, had deliberately buried it beneath the foundation of this sacred place. The air that poured from it was thick, cold, heavy, and carried with it the unmistakable scent of earth, stone, and memory. What lay beyond that tunnel would unravel everything the town believed. It would force them to confront a question far more haunting than where Sister Mary and the children went. But why? Why had this been hidden? Why beneath the house of God? And why, after 3 decades of silence, was the tunnel finally ready to be found? The first step into the tunnel felt like stepping out of time itself. As the workers descended, their flashlights cut through thick air heavy with dust, air that hadn't been touched in over 3 decades. Walls lined with aged stone seemed to swallow the sound of their own footsteps. Every echo fell off, not hollow, not empty, but watched, as if whatever had been buried here wasn't meant to be disturbed. Or perhaps it had been waiting. The further they walked, the more unnatural the silence became. This wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was a silence that felt held, the kind that stretches between breaths right before something terrible or something miraculous happens. As they moved deeper, the faint outline of carvings began to emerge on the walls, crude, hurried, not part of the chapel's original design. Symbols, marks. Some resembled crosses, others looked like warnings, or maybe like prayers. And then the smell shifted. It was no longer just damp earth. There was something else, something sweet, something wrong. It hit one of the men first, a sharp, metallic sting in the back of his throat like iron, like blood. But there was no sign of decay, no bones, no cloth, just the tunnel, leading further into darkness. It was as if the tunnel itself was alive, breathing, holding onto a secret it wasn't sure it was ready to let go. Suddenly, the passage opened into a chamber. Not large, not ornate, but unmistakably man-made. In the center, something that didn't belong in a chapel. A table, carved directly from the stone floor. Around it, remnants of wax melted into the cracks. Symbols were etched into every surface. On the walls, the ceiling, the table itself. Some were in Latin, others unrecognizable. The air here was colder, not the cold of temperature, the cold of absence, the cold of something that had been removed, taken long ago. And then a discovery that turned curiosity into dread. In the far corner of the chamber, half buried in the stone wall, was a small wooden rosary. Fragile, dust-covered, but unmistakably recognizable to anyone who had ever stepped foot in that chapel. It was Sister Mary's, the same one she wore every single day, the one that, for 30 years, had vanished with her. As the rosary was lifted from the dirt, a collective silence fell over the workers, not the kind shared by strangers in fear, but the kind that feels sacred, heavy, like crossing an invisible threshold. Because this was no longer just a missing person case. This was something else, something far more complicated, far more frightening. The question that burned wasn't, "Where is she?" anymore. It was, "What happened here?" The walls seemed to pulse with presence, as if the tunnel itself was aware, reacting to their intrusion. One of the men, a local who had grown up hearing the stories, whispered almost unconsciously, "We shouldn't be here." But no one turned back. Curiosity had given way to something deeper now. A pull, as if whatever truth lived down here wasn't just waiting to be found, it was demanding to be seen. Then one of the flashlights flickered across the far end of the chamber, revealing something no one had noticed at first. Another tunnel, smaller, narrower. It had been sealed, roughly, hastily, with stones and mortar that didn't match the rest of the architecture. The cement was crumbling, the seal was failing, and the unsettling truth settled over everyone at once. This was not a tunnel designed to be used. It was a tunnel designed to be hidden. The decision was instant, though no one really spoke it aloud. The stones were removed carefully, hands trembling as each piece gave way to the darkness beyond. As the final slab crumbled free, a rush of cold air surged out, so sharp it forced everyone to stagger back. And with it came something else, a smell that was not death, but not life either. Something stale, something preserved, something that had waited far too long. And there, just beyond the broken seal, the narrow passage curved downward. A staircase, spiral, cut directly into the earth. The steps were worn, not by time alone, but by use. Heavy use. Many someones had used this path before. And suddenly, a realization struck like a lightning bolt. Whatever happened to Sister Mary and those two children didn't happen by accident. It wasn't random. It was something planned. The air grew heavier with each step down the spiral staircase. Every breath felt thicker, as though the very walls were pressing inward, tightening around anyone bold or foolish enough to descend. The walls of the staircase weren't plain. No, they were covered in markings, but these were different from the frantic carvings in the upper chamber. These were deliberate, precise, etched deep into the stone as though someone intended them to last for centuries. Circles intertwined with crosses, symbols that felt sacred, yet wrong, like someone had bent something holy into something it was never meant to be. As the group descended further, something else became clear. The silence changed. No longer flat, no longer dead. It had rhythm, a pulse, a low, distant thrum, barely audible at first, vibrating through the soles of their boots. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was alive. One man paused, his hand pressed against the wall, whispering to no one, "Do you feel that? It's breathing." The others didn't answer. They felt it too. Finally, the staircase opened into a second chamber. Much larger, oval, domed at the top, as if someone had hollowed out the earth with intention. And there, along the edges, were wooden benches, dust-covered, crumbling, facing the center. This wasn't a hiding place. It wasn't a crypt. It was a gathering place, a space meant for witnesses, or participants. In the very center of the room stood an object that made every heart in the chamber stop. A stone arch, small, almost like a doorway, but leading to nowhere. Beneath it, a hole, a pit, circular, perfectly smooth along the edges as though worn by hands, or something else. The pit wasn't deep, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but its darkness swallowed the light of their flashlights completely. Nothing reflected back, not even the beam itself. It was as though the pit didn't hold darkness. It was darkness, and just beside that pit, pressed against the base of the arch, lay something that stole the air from every chest in that room. A child's shoe, small, brown leather, cracked by time, but unmistakably real, dust-covered, yet somehow looking as though it had been placed there on purpose, as if whoever left it wanted it to be found, eventually. No one spoke for several long minutes. The weight of the discovery was suffocating. This wasn't just evidence. It wasn't just a clue. It was a statement. Someone had brought the orphans down here. Someone had sealed this place, knowing full well what it meant. The realization settled over them like a burial shroud. This was never meant to be discovered. Whatever happened here wasn't an accident of history. It was intentional, controlled, ritual, and then something else. One of the workers, scanning the walls with a flashlight, noticed a section where the carvings looked different, newer, sharper, like they hadn't been subjected to the same erosion as everything else. Approaching it cautiously, he brushed away the thick veil of dust and grime. And there, carved deeper than anything else in the chamber, were 3 names. Sister Mary Agnes, Elsie, Thomas. Beneath the names, a date. The very day they disappeared, carved in a stone, as though someone had memorialized the event not after it happened, but as it was happening, or before, as if it was always meant to be part of this place. A name etched in as a declaration, or a warning. A sudden sound shattered the silence. Not a voice, not movement, but a chime, sharp, metallic, echoing up from the pit. Not random, not accidental, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3, then silence. It wasn't possible. The pit was empty, or at least, it looked empty. One of the men, trembling, leaned over with his flashlight, but the beam disappeared into the void like before, swallowed whole by something that defied explanation. And then, from deep within that suffocating blackness, something else. A whisper. Faint, fragile, but real. Words carried upward, distorted but unmistakable. Help us. The men staggered back. Some ran. Others fell to their knees, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming horror of a realization that couldn't be escaped now. Whatever had happened here 30 years ago hadn't ended. Panic surged through every man in that chamber. Hands trembled, breath caught halfway between gasps and prayers. But none of them could move far. Something in the air, in the gravity of the place, held them there, rooted to the floor as though the earth itself refused to let them leave. The whisper hadn't been imagination. It was too real, too sharp, too present. Not a memory, not an echo. Something alive, something waiting. The man nearest the pit dropped to his knees, unable to stop himself. His flashlight rolled across the stone floor, its beam flickering and landing against another corner of the room. And there, revealed in that trembling light, was something that hadn't been noticed before. A set of handprints. Small, too small for any adult, imprinted into the dusty stone wall. Not painted, not carved, just pressed, as though small hands, children's hands, had pushed against the wall with such desperation that the moisture from their skin had fused with dust, leaving behind a perfect outline, frozen in time. The silence that followed was the kind that makes the body shake. A silence that didn't just fill the air, it consumed it. Everyone present could feel it now. The weight, the hum, the sense that they were no longer just visitors in this space, but participants, whether they wanted to be or not. Because whatever this place was, whatever purpose it once served, it was never closed, never abandoned, only waiting. Then a breeze. Out of nowhere. Cold. Cutting. A wind where there should be none, spiraling up from the mouth of the pit. The flashlight beam flickered wildly as the air shifted, and with it movement. Something in the pit. Not a shadow, not a figure, but shapes, glimpses, the flash of something pale, the edge of fabric, the brief, horrifying suggestion of a face, not clear enough to be certain, but not unclear enough to dismiss. And then another sound, this time not a whisper, but a breath. Slow, ragged, alive. One of the men, voice cracking, managed to force out a single question that everyone was too afraid to ask, but couldn't hold back anymore. Are you still here? And for a moment, there was no response, just silence. And then, clear, impossible, undeniable, the answer came. A voice, childlike, fragile, whispered, but sharp enough to cut through the bone. We never left. The room itself seemed to contract, as if the walls were drawing closer, suffocating every ounce of courage still left in the group. Those 3 words, we never left, didn't echo like normal sound. They sank. They folded themselves into the skin, into the marrow, into the places no scream could ever reach. And suddenly, every question that had hung in the air for 30 long years shifted. It was never about where Sister Mary and the two children had gone. The real question, the unbearable one, was whether they had ever been gone at all. No one dared move toward the pit now. No one dared speak. Even breathing felt like a violation of the fragile tension that held the chamber hostage. But despite the dread, despite the overwhelming desire to run, something else began to stir beneath the fear. A realization, a terrible, holy knowing, that this wasn't a tomb. This wasn't a grave. It was a threshold. One man, barely able to stand, scanned the edges of the room with his flashlight. And there, on the far wall, half hidden behind a collapsed bench, he saw something else. More writing. But this wasn't like the symbols above. This was clean, recent, written in jagged strokes of what looked like charcoal, but somehow darker, more permanent. 4 words. Just 4. It never truly closed. And as the words sank in, the pulse in the ground intensified. A vibration, deep, constant, began to tremble beneath their feet. Not shaking the room, shaking them. From the inside out. A sound that wasn't a sound. A hum that wasn't in the air, but in the blood. In the bones. Then came a second voice. Not a whisper this time. Clear. Measured. A voice that once belonged to a woman. Familiar. Gentle. And yet heavy with sorrow. They made sure no one would hear. And as those words unraveled into the darkness, a wave of understanding struck everyone present. This wasn't just about the day Sister Mary and those 2 children vanished. It was about what the chapel had been built over, about what it was meant to seal, about what had never truly been locked away. The air grew colder, heavier with each passing second. The light from the flashlights flickered, as if something unseen was draining their energy. Some of the men backed toward the staircase, instinctively drawn to any possible escape, but their feet hesitated, as though the very stone beneath them held their souls in place. Their minds screamed to flee, but something deeper, something more primal, told them they had crossed a line that could no longer be uncrossed. At the far end of the chamber, cracks began to form along the wall, slow at first, then spreading like veins across the stone. Dust spilled from the fractures, filling the air, making it hard to breathe. One of the workers, coughing, covered his mouth and pointed with a shaking hand. There, behind the cracking wall shapes, not full figures, not solid forms, but shadows, moving independently of the flashlight beams, as if responding to something ancient, something awakening. A low, guttural sound began to rise from deep within the pit. Not a voice, not a growl, something older than language. A resonance that moved through the stone, through the air, through the lungs of every man in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was overwhelming. Their ears rang, their chests tightened, their knees buckled. And beneath that sound, there was something else, an almost imperceptible rhythm. A chant, slow, unintelligible, but undeniably human and undeniably real. Suddenly, one of the men noticed something at the base of the stone archway. A small, hand-carved cross, barely visible beneath the dust and debris. He knelt and brushed it clean, revealing something even more chilling. The cross wasn't decorative. It was part of a sentence, etched in Latin, just beneath the surface. The translation came quickly, whispered by Father Lucian, the only clergyman present. This place holds what must never rise. The words hit like a punch to the chest. Every unanswered question from the past 30 years now twisted into something far worse than they'd feared. Sister Mary and the 2 children weren't just missing. They were part of something locked away, something that had never been meant to see the light of day. And now, after decades of silence, that lock was failing. Without warning, the ground beneath them shifted. Not violently, not like an earthquake. It was more subtle, more intentional. A slow, rolling movement that seemed to breathe under their feet, like the earth itself exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Dust fell from the ceiling, thin cracks appearing along the dome above. But the most terrifying change wasn't structural. It was sensory. The air, once stale and cold, now grew warm, almost humid, as if something below was waking, moving, rising. The flashlight beams swayed wildly as men scrambled toward the staircase, desperate for air, for light, for escape. But before they could reach the first step, another sound stopped them cold. The unmistakable sound of a hymn. soft, fragile, sung in a child's voice. The melody floated upward from the pit, a lullaby that Sister Mary had often sung during evening prayers. It wasn't possible, but there it was, clear, sweet, and devastating. One of the older workers fell to his knees, sobbing. He had been a child in the orphanage 30 years ago. He remembered that song, remembered Sister Mary's voice, remembered the two children who had held her hands that day as they walked toward the chapel, never to return. And now, here it was, rising from the blackness beneath their feet like a memory too heavy to stay buried. Then, with terrifying slowness, the darkness inside the pit began to change. Not in color, but in texture. What had once looked like empty space now seemed dense, like liquid shadow, shifting and folding onto itself. And within that churning blackness, there emerged shapes. Small hands, thin arms, the outline of a habit, faces not quite formed, but formed enough. And in one unified, breathless moment, every man in that room realized the unbearable truth. They weren't hearing echoes. They weren't imagining voices. Sister Mary and the two children were still there, waiting, watching, trapped in a place where time no longer moved forward. The moment stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the figures within the swirling darkness became more defined. Not fully solid, not fully spirit, something in between. A liminal existence suspended in a prison made of shadow, memory, and forgotten rituals. The faint glimmer of Sister Mary's veil fluttered in a wind that didn't exist. Her arms wrapped tightly around the two children, as if shielding them, not from the men standing above, but from something deeper, something still unseen, something that owned this place. A single step echoed through the chamber, not from any of the workers, but from somewhere within the pit. The figures flinched, not from the men, but in fear of what followed that step. Suddenly, every symbol on the walls, every crude carving, every cross defaced, every spiral etched, began to glow faintly. Not bright, not holy, a dull, pulsing red, like embers in the aftermath of a fire that never truly went out. The hum beneath the floor grew louder, now unmistakably rhythmic, like breathing, like a heartbeat, but not one heart, many, layered, staggered, as if something beneath the earth was stirring, flexing after decades of stillness. A wet, shifting sound slithered from the dark corners of the pit. Something not quite solid, not quite liquid, something becoming. And then the voice. Not from Sister Mary, not from the children, but from something deeper, something behind them, something that had always been here, long before the chapel was ever built. A voice that didn't speak with words, but with weight. A crushing presence that flooded the minds of everyone in the chamber. You broke the seal. The lights flickered wildly. Some flashlights died completely, swallowed by the oppressive dark. Others glitched, flashing random patterns across the walls, revealing flashes of things, shapes that should not exist, shadows that moved wrong, eyes that reflected no light. Panic surged, but the staircase, the only exit, felt miles away now, swallowed by the expanding shadow that oozed from the pit, creeping slowly toward the edges of the room. Frozen between the instinct to flee and the horrifying pull of the unknown, the men could only watch as the darkness slithered outward. It wasn't moving like smoke or water. It was moving with purpose, almost as if it were tasting the air, deciding, choosing. And every step it crept forward, the voice grew heavier. Not louder, heavier, like sound forged from gravity itself, pressing against their ribs, tightening around their lungs. It was never meant to open. The ground trembled beneath their feet, not violently, but deeply. A low-frequency vibration that made bones ache and teeth chatter. Cracks splintered along the dome overhead, thin fingers of stone and dust cascading down like the breath of something waking beneath centuries of silence. A presence began to rise, not seen yet, but felt. An enormous mass. Not a creature, not a figure. Something larger. Something woven into the earth itself. And then, movement from within the pit. Sister Mary's face, pale, hollow-eyed, lips moving without sound, turned upward, slowly, mechanical, as if every muscle resisted. Her eyes locked with the men above. Not pleading, Not angry, just tired, defeated. Her mouth trembled as a single word finally escaped. Brittle, fractured, but undeniable. Run. The air snapped. A sudden gust blew through the chamber, extinguishing every remaining light. Total darkness swallowed them, except for the faint, pulsing red from the symbols lining the walls. And in that suffocating black came a new sound. A cracking, splitting, like the earth itself was fracturing open. A noise so deep it wasn't heard. It was felt, like the echo of something ancient, something vast, something finally stretching its limbs after an eternity of waiting. And then, from the abyss below, a single, monstrous eye opened, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything, watching, a presence that wasn't asking questions, a presence that didn't need to, because it had been waiting for them. Time fractured in that moment. Seconds stretched into eternities. No one knew if they were standing there for mere heartbeats or for something far longer, something unnatural. The eye within the pit was unlike anything the human mind was designed to comprehend. It wasn't merely seeing them, it was knowing them. Every thought, every secret, every memory that had ever been buried under shame, regret, or fear was suddenly laid bare, exposed beneath that gaze as though their souls were nothing more than glass. The walls pulsed again, the crimson symbols glowing brighter, as if reacting to the presence. But it wasn't light, not really. It was something pretending to be light, something mimicking the sacred while being its opposite. The men stumbled backward, their mouths opening to scream, but no sound emerged. Their voices had been stolen, or maybe smothered beneath the crushing weight of whatever ancient force was rising from the pit. And in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that suffocates rather than comforts, Sister Mary's figure shifted. Slowly, as though moving through thick water, she released the two children from her arms. The children didn't resist. They stood, hollow, expressionless, their faces pale mirrors of something no longer entirely human. They turned in unison toward the pit, toward the eye, and slowly began walking toward it. The air cracked with the sound of splitting stone. The ground buckled beneath their feet, dust pouring from the ceiling like falling ash. The humming wasn't a hum anymore. It was a chant, layered voices, some human, others not, speaking in languages long dead, or perhaps never meant for the world of the living. A chorus of sorrow, of suffering, of binding, not to call something forth, but to keep something in. And that's when it became clear, horrifyingly clear, that the chapel above wasn't built to bless the earth. It wasn't a house of God. It was a lock, a seal, a cage disguised as sanctuary. And the tunnel beneath? Not an accident, not a secret passage. It was the keyhole, and someone had finally turned the key. The eye narrowed, not with sight, but with intention. Its surface wasn't flesh, nor glass, nor anything the physical world could claim. It was shifting, breathing. The surface moved like liquid shadow, swirling with the images of faces, some screaming, some weeping, others frozen in hollow, empty silence. Flashes of Sister Mary, of the two children, of others. Faces not from 30 years ago, but from centuries past. Generations who had vanished, been forgotten, erased by time, now staring back. The sound shifted again, louder, closer, a scraping, a dragging, something enormous moving just beyond the edge of vision. The stone arch above the pit began to glow, not with warmth, but with a violent, unnatural heat. Hairline fractures raced across it like lightning. And then, the floor trembled violently as the first long, skeletal hand rose from the pit. Elongated fingers, thin as bones, stretched outward, not toward the men, but toward the children standing obediently at the edge. Sister Mary lunged, trying to grab them, her arms trembling as though fighting against something invisible, something pulling her backward, restraining her from intervening. Her voice, weak but desperate, finally broke through the pressure crushing the air. No, not again. Not again. The skeletal hand hovered for a moment, then stopped. The eye shifted its gaze, away from the children, toward the men, toward the ones who had broken the seal. And for the first time since they had entered the tunnel, a sound rose from the pit that was unmistakably laughter. But it wasn't laughter made for human ears. It was broken, hollow, a sound that belonged to something that had waited too long in the dark, something that had tasted freedom once and was about to taste it again. Then the cracks in the arch split wide. The stone shattered, a blinding light, not pure, not holy, but violent, exploded outward, filling the chamber with a surge of heat, sound, and something else. Something wrong, something heavy, something hungry. And with that eruption, the realization struck every soul in the room with horrifying clarity. This was never about rescuing the past. It was about surviving what had been set free. The explosion of violent light didn't dissipate. It lingered, pressing against skin, seeping into pores, saturating the lungs as if the air itself had turned poisonous. It wasn't blinding in the way light should be. It was devouring. It swallowed shadows, swallowed depth, swallowed reality itself. The chamber became a void of white and crimson, where shapes warped and the edges of the world blurred, folding in on themselves like fragile paper left in fire. The skeletal hand grew longer, stretching impossibly far, bending at angles no living bone should endure. Its fingers scraped against the stone floor, carving deep grooves as it pulled itself further from the abyss. Something massive shifted below. Not one shape, not one creature, but a massive something, something made of limbs, faces, whispers, and suffering stitched together by forces long forgotten. A cathedral of flesh and shadow, bound to a hunger so ancient that the memory of it had been erased from history. Until now. Sister Mary collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed together in prayer, not out of faith, but out of desperation. Her voice trembled as she murmured words half-remembered, half-invented, a prayer not written in any book, a prayer meant to hold back the tide of something that had never been meant to wake. Tears streaked her face, and her eyes never left the two children, still standing, still silent, as if caught between worlds, between what they were and what they were being pulled toward becoming. Then the ground beneath the pit broke. Not like cracking stone. No, it split open as though the very fabric of the world tore apart. The chant that had once been distant now roared, louder than any storm, louder than any scream. Voices, thousands, maybe more, rising in agonizing harmony. Not all human. Some were too deep, some too shrill, some layered in frequencies the human ear wasn't made to hear. But all of them cried the same message in 1,000 languages long dead. The seal is broken. The gate is open. One of the men stumbled backward, blood running from his ears as the sound pierced through him. He screamed, or tried to, but no sound left his mouth. His eyes locked on the children for a moment, and that's when he saw it. Their skin, flickering, phasing, as though beneath their small forms were other shapes, larger, elongated, drifting just beneath the surface, ready to break through. Their faces flickered between innocent and monstrous, mouths stretching wide in silence, as if the only thing holding them in place was the fragile illusion of their former selves. The temperature plummeted instantly, turning the chamber into something that felt like the breath of a tomb left sealed for eternity. Frost formed on the edges of the broken arch. The pulsing symbols on the walls now bled light, as though trying to contain something too large for the space they guarded. But it was failing. Everything was failing. The seal, the stones, the centuries of prayers, all of it unraveling like thread pulled from the edge of a tapestry, revealing the horrifying emptiness beneath. The eye remained open, unblinking, but it no longer needed to watch. It had already chosen. From the edge of the pit, something began to rise. Not fast, not violent, but slow, deliberate. Tall shapes, humanoid but stretched far beyond the limits of human anatomy, pulled themselves upward, their limbs contorting, folding, snapping into place, as if assembling bodies from pieces that had never quite fit together. And then the laughter returned. Not a sound, a vibration, a pressure that pushed against rib cages and skulls. A mocking, joyous pulse that belonged to something that knew exactly what was happening, because it had waited for this. It had been fed by waiting, by the silence, by the forgetting, by the arrogance of believing that the chapel above was ever enough to hold it back. Sister Mary screamed, but not in fear, in defiance. Her voice cracked the chant, if only for a moment. She hurled herself toward the children, trying to pull them back, her hands gripping their arms that were now ice cold, barely flesh, barely anything human anymore. The figures staggered. Their forms glitched between child and other, flickering like broken reflections in water. From the pit's endless mouth came one final word. Not shouted, not spoken, declared. A voice layered in thousands of other voices, some male, some female, some in languages long lost to dust, rising together as one force. Release. The air folded inward. The stone collapsed in on itself. The hum turned to a roar, the roar of the earth breaking, the scream of something that had waited far too long and was no longer willing to wait another second. The collapse wasn't loud in the way rockfall should be. It was deeper, the kind of sound that isn't just heard, but felt, the kind that rattles the bones from the inside out, that compresses the air until the lungs forget how to breathe. The ground split beneath their feet, hairline fractures racing across the floor like veins of shadow, glowing crimson at their edges. What once was solid was now trembling, a surface stretched thin over something vast, alive, and merciless below. Sister Mary's grip on the children tightened as they convulsed beneath her touch. Their faces, those fragile, flickering masks of innocence, split for the briefest moment into something unspeakable. Mouths opened too wide, too long. Eyes stretched sideways, not upwards, fracturing into rows of black, hollow voids that reflected nothing. But then, just as quickly, their forms snapped back. Small hands, small faces, two trembling orphans again, staring at her with pleading eyes. Eyes that whispered, "Don't let go." The other men, those who hadn't already collapsed to their knees or fled into blind panic, were paralyzed, caught in the gravitational pull of something bigger than terror. One tried to speak, to whisper a prayer, but the words dissolved as soon as they left his lips, swallowed by the vibrating, hungry air. The chamber itself now felt less like a room and more like a throat, closing, constricting, preparing to swallow everything inside. And then, from the shattered arch, a shape began to rise. Slow, agonizing, a figure, taller than any man, forged from the same black fluid that churned in the pit. Its limbs stretched unnaturally thin, shoulders disjointed, its head tilted sideways as though broken, or as though it never belonged on any neck to begin with. Beneath the dripping, shadow-like skin, shapes moved. Hands, faces, mouths, twisting and writhing, pushing against the membrane of the figure's body as though desperate to escape or desperate to become part of it. It moved without walking. No footsteps, no weight. It floated, dragged upward by threads of something unseen, some inverse gravity that pulled not toward the earth but away from it, toward somewhere else. And as it rose, the eye below pulsed once, twice, then vanished. Gone, leaving only the void behind. But the presence remained. Fully, completely. No longer below. No longer waiting. It was here. The chamber buckled. The cracks along the walls deepened, veins of pulsing red light leaking like open wounds across the stone. Pieces of the ceiling rained down in splintering chunks. The once sacred space, or what everyone believed was sacred, now revealed itself for what it truly was: a seal, a barrier, a desperate attempt by hands long dead to hold back something that never should have existed, something that now stood in the center of the room, towering and trembling with the anticipation of release. Sister Mary trembled, shielding the children behind her, as the entity's head twisted unnaturally, its fractured face scanning the room. It didn't have eyes, but somehow it saw straight through flesh, straight into marrow, straight into the parts of the soul that even the living themselves refused to acknowledge. The mouth, if it could be called that, opened, stretching sideways, splitting into segments like a predator that never needed teeth to consume. And from that void it spoke, not in sound but in thought, a thought that slammed against the walls of every mind in the room. You broke the silence. You opened the gate. Now you belong. The air thickened. A pressure wave rolled outward from the entity, flattening men against walls, forcing blood from noses, ears, and eyes. The temperature snapped downward, frost crystallizing instantly across skin, stone, even breath itself. The chanting rose again, but this time not from below. It came from within, from the very walls, from the bones of the earth, from the marrow of every stone that had ever been part of this place. And then a second shape emerged from the pit. Smaller, humanoid, fragile, a child, but not one of the orphans. No, this one was older. Its form faded at the edges like an image struggling to hold itself together. Its eyes were empty hollows, yet somehow overflowed with the kind of sadness that could only come from eternity spent in waiting. It stepped forward, tiny hands outstretched, and pointed, not at Sister Mary, not at the children, but at the men who had opened the tunnel. You brought it back. The weight of those words sank deeper than bone. This was never about what had been trapped. It was about what had been invited back, what had been searching for a crack, a fracture, a moment of weakness to return. And now, with the seal broken, it wasn't just this chapel. It wasn't just this town. It was the world. A door had opened, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was prepared for what was about to come through. A pulse thundered through the chamber. Not a sound, but a force. It hit the chest first, then the head, then the legs, as if gravity itself had shifted sideways. Some men collapsed, clutching their heads, screaming without sound. Others stumbled backward, toward the staircase, only to find that the tunnel behind them was gone. Not collapsed, not buried, simply gone, as though it had never existed in the first place. As though the world they knew had folded shut behind them, trapping them in this moment between one reality and the next. The towering figure above the pit shifted, contorting in ways that broke every natural rule of anatomy. Its limbs snapped backward, forward, rotating like clock hands spun by a lunatic. Inside its writhing mass, faces continued to press against the surface of its skin, eyes open, mouths agape, as if still conscious, still aware, still trapped. One of the faces, unmistakably, was that of a priest who had gone missing 50 years earlier. Another was a child whose photo had once hung on the orphanage wall. Sister Mary, weak, shaking, reached out her trembling hands toward the children. "Look at me. Stay with me. Stay here," she begged, her voice cracking under the weight of sheer despair. But the children's forms were flickering, one moment small, fragile, tangible, the next transparent, stretched, pixelated like reflections caught between broken mirrors. They were slipping, not dying, not transforming, phasing between what they were and what the pit was demanding them to become. And then came the sound. A knock. Slow, deliberate, measured, not from the pit, not from the creature, but from the walls themselves. As if something beyond, something larger still, had heard the seal break. A second knock, louder, closer, followed by the unmistakable groan of stone under pressure. Not collapsing, opening. Somewhere beyond this chamber, something else was stirring. Something bigger than even the thing that stood before them. The towering figure paused, its head tilted, listening, reacting. A long, slow ripple moved across its skin, as though it, too, had just realized that what had been released was not the only thing waiting behind the veil. The cracks along the walls flared bright crimson, and with that a deeper, older voice, layered, impossibly vast, vibrated through the bones of the earth itself. "The first door is open." A sound like air being sucked out of the room collapsed everything into stillness. Not silence, stillness. A suffocating, absolute halt of everything. No breath, no movement, no sound. The air hung like frozen glass, thick and solid, as if the laws of nature themselves had buckled under the pressure of something far older than the concept of nature. The entity from the pit froze mid-contortion, head still tilted unnaturally sideways, as though listening to a command coming from somewhere far beyond this space. The glow of the runes along the walls dimmed, not extinguished, but pulled inward, as if the light itself had realized it was no longer sufficient to hold back what was now awake. And then, the floor trembled, not with the chaotic vibration of collapse, but with the heavy, metronomic thud, thud, thud of footsteps, not from the creature in front of them, but from beyond the walls. Something was coming. Something large, something deliberate. The ground flexed with each impact, sending waves of dust pouring down from the ceiling. Sister Mary, face pale as bone, gripped the children tighter. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "It's not just this place. It's not just us." Her eyes, hollow with dread, scanned the chamber. She understood it now. The truth was too big for words. This chapel, this seal, it was never meant to hold everything. It was just the first layer, one lock in a chain of locks. And now, the chain was unraveling. From the cracks, from the holes in the walls, fingers emerged. Dozens, hundreds, pale, skeletal, crawling, searching, scraping across stone in a frantic, rabid hunger, as if the very walls had begun to give birth to the countless things that had been imprisoned alongside the creature in the pit. Shadows with teeth, mouths with no faces, limbs without bodies, all of it pouring forward in chaotic waves. And in the midst of it all, the voice returned. Low, measured, inevitable. Not a shout, not a scream, a statement. A cosmic truth that had waited longer than memory itself to be spoken aloud. The second door begins to fracture. The walls pulsed, not with light, but with breath. They were no longer stone, no longer boundaries. They were skin, flesh, the muscle of something unspeakably vast pressing against the edges of the world, testing the limits of what reality could still hold. Each crack along the surface split wider, veins of dark crimson and shadow spreading like infection. The fingers clawing their way through became arms, then torsos, bodies malformed, unfinished, built from screams and suffering stitched into shape by the sheer will of hunger. The air tightened, crushing rib cages, forcing breath from lungs. Each sound became distant, warped, as though underwater. Even the screams, the desperate, primal howls of the men who now clawed at vanished walls, felt like echoes from another world. The staircase, the tunnel, the way out gone. No exit, no escape, only the suffocating presence of something that wasn't merely in the chamber. It was the chamber. The chapel had never been a building. It had always been a mouth, and now it was opening. The children trembled, their hands gripping Sister Mary's robe so tightly their knuckles turned bone white. Their forms continued to flicker between flesh and shadow, innocence and monstrosity. Every breath seemed to teeter on a choice, whether they would remain what they were, or become part of what was coming through. And as Sister Mary whispered prayers long forgotten by heaven, her tears fell into the cracks, vanishing into the pulsing veins beneath her knees. The monstrous figure from the pit no longer stood alone. Around it rose others, shapes of varying sizes, each as wrong as the last, twisted parodies of life. Creatures born from nightmares deeper than human consciousness had ever dared to reach. Faces stretched sideways, mouths opening where eyes should be, limbs splitting into more limbs, folding and unfolding in endless patterns of impossible geometry. And then, from the furthest crack in the wall, a sound. Not a roar, not a chant, not even speech. A sound older than language. The wet, grinding shudder of something unfolding. Something massive. A shape too large for the mind to process. Pressing closer, forcing reality to warp around its presence. As though the walls of the world itself were beginning to buckle. And beneath that sound, words emerged. Not spoken aloud, but branded into the minds of every living thing in that chamber. The third door trembles. A wave of pressure surged outward. Not heat, not cold, something worse. The sensation of existence itself thinning. The edges of the world became blurry. Time staggered, fractured, looping for seconds at a time. Breath, footstep, scream, breath, footstep, scream, over and over, like a broken reel, until it suddenly snapped forward, reality lurching like a beast choking on its own bones. The pit no longer looked like a pit. It was growing, stretching, warping. It became a spiral. No, a throat. A gaping maw of liquid shadow, stretching far deeper than the earth could possibly allow. Inside was not earth, not stone, but sky, stars, endless swirling void, a place not meant for the living. A place where gravity itself seemed to twist sideways, pulling light and sound downward into a center that no, I could fully comprehend. Sister Mary's voice broke. They weren't sealing a tunnel. They were sealing a gate to something that isn't supposed to be remembered. Her words were swallowed as the pressure forced her flat to the floor, her hands still clutching the children as their forms trembled between realities. Their faces caught in an agonizing flicker between who they were and what the pit was trying to make them become. Above the spiral, the air split open. A tear, a wound in the fabric of everything. From it, something vast and boneless began to push through, tendrils of wet shadow, folding in and out of themselves, as if searching for structure, for shape, for flesh to occupy. Each movement dripped with the faces of others, some screaming, some whispering, some locked in expressions of absolute, eternal silence. And then, everything paused. The tremor stopped. The pit went still. The creatures froze mid-crawl. A breath, massive, collective, as though the entire universe had drawn air into its lungs. And then, in a voice that shattered every concept of sound, every boundary of hearing, every defense the soul could ever muster, it spoke. The fourth door unlocks. The chamber didn't collapse. It folded inward, folded sideways, folding into a shape no geometry could explain. The scream pressed into the shape of space itself. The last thing any of them saw was the light above, snapping into black. As the gate opened, the fold wasn't destruction in the way humans understand it. It was erasure, a peeling back of reality itself, as if the world had been nothing more than thin fabric stretched over a hollow frame. Stone dissolved into mist. Flesh unraveled into threads of shadow and light. Time itself buckled, compressing into something sickening. A constant looping scream layered beneath the roar of something far older than the earth, something that had waited behind locked doors longer than the idea of time had ever existed. The gate stood open now. No longer a pit, no longer a wound, but a threshold, a place where the rules that held reality together dissolved completely. From within it came shapes, too large, too fluid, too impossible. Living architecture, moving labyrinths of flesh and bone, woven with faces that blinked open like windows. Arms growing from walls that stretched into corridors that spiraled back into mouths lined with teeth, made of broken prayers. The children clung to Sister Mary, but their forms were paper-thin now, silhouettes flickering between what they had been and what the abyss demanded them to become. Their cries were warped, slowed, as though heard through water, or through the folds of some reality that no longer operated by the rules of gravity, sound, or mercy. And then, the sky opened. Not the ceiling, the sky. A rift cracked wide above the spiral, revealing a void so deep, so vast, it made the concept of emptiness feel arrogant. From within it came, not creatures, not figures, but forces. Spiraling masses of color that didn't exist on any spectrum. Shapes that changed every time the eye tried to hold them. And with them, a sound deeper than thought. The hum of something that wasn't just arriving, but returning. The voice, that voice, layered in agony, joy, hunger, and divinity all at once, boomed again. This time louder than existence itself. The fifth door is wide. Every man who had entered the tunnel dropped where they stood. Not from fear, not from injury, but from the sheer collapse of will. The breaking of the mind when confronted with a truth too large to hold. Some fell into fetal positions, whispering broken fragments of their own names. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, as though watching the collapse of something they had never truly understood until now. The boundary between existence and everything else. The monstrous figure, the one that had risen first from the pit, no longer stood alone. Its form blurred, melting back into the greater mass, now flooding from the spiral. Endless limbs, mouths, eyes, structures folding into other structures. A library of suffering. A cathedral of the forgotten. Entire architectures built from the remnants of souls. Each brick a memory, a scream, a life devoured and reshaped into something with no beginning and no end. Sister Mary held the children tighter, her hands glowing faintly now. Not with light, but with something else. The last flicker of resistance. Of defiance. Her lips moved, whispering prayers not spoken for centuries. Words older than the chapel, older than language. Her body trembled as Shadow tried to peel her fingers away, to claim the small, fragile forms of the two children locked in her grasp. And then a tremor. But not from below. From above. A new sound, deeper, older still. A metallic groan. A grinding hinge. A lock turning. The sky itself folded, twisted into impossible spirals. Black against black. And through the swirling vortex came a singular, violent burst of pressure. The ground split entirely, not like a crack, but like the peeling of skin. A final voice spoke. This one not layered, not whispered, but pure. Singular. Commanding. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was simply hungry. The sixth door falls. The veil wasn't torn anymore. There was no veil left. Nothing between this world and what lay beyond. The gate wasn't open. The gate was gone. And now, so was everything that had once been meant to hold it closed. In that instant, the concept of place vanished. The chapel, the tunnel, the chamber, all of it folded out of reality like paper consumed by fire. What remained wasn't a space, but a state. A realm where distance, time, and shape lost meaning. The floor became horizon. The ceiling became depth. The sky became a wound, swirling with eyes that opened and closed without form, without number. The children no longer flickered. Their bodies hung suspended between light and shadow, caught in a web of forces tearing them in two directions. Sister Mary, her arms shaking, pulled them close, screaming against the roar. Not a scream of fear, but a scream of pure defiance. Her voice cracked with something deeper than desperation. It carried the last thread of humanity left in a place now devoured by the memory of what came before the world was ever born. Above, the gate pulsed. No longer just an opening, now an entity itself. Alive, breathing, hungering. Its edges rippled like muscle beneath torn flesh, and through it poured tides of geometry that defied sanity. Towers made of teeth, staircases of writhing spines, creatures without faces but with countless mouths lined along their torsos, chanting, whispering, laughing, inviting. And then, the silence broke again, but not with sound, with absence. A void so complete that even the memory of noise vanished. Color faded, light extinguished. The swirling mass above folded inward, as though collapsing into a single point, a pinprick of infinite density. And from it, one final sentence, carved directly into the marrow of every living being still present. The seventh door is no more. It wasn't an opening. It was an unmaking. A declaration that the barriers that once held back the infinite were erased. Not broken, not opened, but simply erased from existence. Reality shattered like glass dropped from the edge of the cosmos. The air itself fractured, leaving behind shards of space that hovered, spinning, reflecting memories that no longer had owners. Faces of the long dead. Moments torn from the past, present, and future, stitched together in jagged mosaics of grief, horror, and helplessness. The figures pouring through the gate shifted again. No longer simply creatures. They became shapes of influence, forces, emotions personified into writhing forms. One mass, tall and thin, walked on legs made of collapsed time, dragging behind it a veil stitched from the breath of every dying man who had ever whispered please into the dark. Another floated, a sphere lined with hands that opened and closed like mouths, each grasping, pleading, grasping again. Sister Mary held tighter. The children cried, not like humans, not like monsters, but like something caught between existence and annihilation. Their cries echoed into the folding void, reverberating not as sound, but as tremors through the collapsing skeleton of what was once the world. Her hands bled from the effort of holding them back. Not from injury, but from the sheer strain of resisting oblivion itself. But even defiance had limits, and the limits were cracking. The gate, if it could still be called that, pulsed one final time, and then it inhaled. A breath, a universal breath, a pulling, sucking force that dragged not just matter but meaning. Names, memories, identities, whole lifetimes peeled away like thin layers of skin beneath a surgeon's knife, made of gravity and grief. The pulse tightened. Sister Mary's lips moved faster, reciting fragments of prayers, fragments of songs, fragments of hope. Her voice barely audible now against the hurricane of everything breaking around her. Her eyes locked on the children, or on the last fragments of them still held in flesh. But the question now burned heavier than ever before. Would it be enough? Or were they simply the last screams before the final fold, before the end of all doors? The inhaling void twisted everything that once made sense. Up was no longer above. Down was no longer below. Space folded inside itself, then unfolded sideways, creating horizons made of bones, skies stitched from mourning, and rivers that flowed, not with water, but with memory, memories of lives erased, of history swallowed whole by the thing that now pulsed at the center of everything. The children's forms grew more transparent with each passing second. Their little hands, once warm, were now cold silhouettes, stretching thin like smoke on the edge of being torn apart. Their eyes, hollow, yet pleading, locked with Sister Mary's. They weren't speaking, but their faces begged a question so primal, so devastating it shredded what was left of her strength. Please, don't let us become part of it. Sister Mary's hands trembled violently. Her fingernails dug into her palms until blood mixed with dust. She choked back a sob and drew them tighter, wrapping them in every ounce of what remained in her. But her prayers were fraying. The words, once weapons against the dark, now felt like paper held against the storm. Still, she whispered them, over and over, not because she believed they would save her, but because it was the only thing left to do. Because if the abyss demanded everything, it would take her last breath fighting it. And then something shifted, not in the chamber, not in the sky, but in the hum itself. A subtle stutter, a fracture in the rhythm. The endless pulse that had felt inevitable, unstoppable, now faltered. Not broke, not stopped, but hesitated, as if some presence, buried beneath centuries of suffering, beneath layers of horror stacked like sediment, resisted. A presence that didn't belong to the abyss, but had been trapped within it. Something still fighting. The monstrous cathedral of shadow hovering above twisted, convulsed, rippling like muscle caught in seizure. Its mouth shrieked, its eyes clenched shut, its tendrils recoiled for the first time, not in triumph, but in pain, as though something deep within the labyrinth of the void was tearing free, something that had been hidden, protected, buried for this exact moment. A light, faint, pathetic, a pinprick against the ocean of endless black, but real. It bloomed from within the spiral. Not a clean light, not holy, but fractured, dim, flickering like the last ember in a field of ash. Yet it pulsed. Once, twice. With each pulse, the shrieking mass convulsed harder. The geometry of the void twisted, as if the very fabric of this false, collapsing reality recoiled from something it had failed to digest. The figures clawing through the walls froze, twitching, their limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. Only the grinding of teeth against teeth, the splintering of bone against bone, like a monstrous engine stalling against some invisible force it was never designed to overcome. Sister Mary felt it, a warmth against her fingertips. She looked down. The children's hands weren't just flickering anymore. They were stabilizing. Not completely, but enough. Enough for their fingers to grip hers tighter. Enough for them to exist here, now, in defiance of the spiral's hunger. Tears streamed down her face as the realization crashed into her. The abyss wasn't immune to resistance. It wasn't invincible. It was only inevitable, if they believed it to be. The spiral shuddered violently, tearing open at the edges. From within came a sound no one could mistake. Not the voice of the creature, not the layered horrors, but the echoes of every soul it had swallowed. Thousands, millions. A chorus, not of pain, not of terror, but of remembrance. Names spoken aloud, histories reasserted, a declaration that even in oblivion, identity endured. And then, for the first time since the seventh door fell, the abyss recoiled. It pulled back, not fully but enough. Enough for a crack to split along the wall of the spiral. A tear, a breach. On the other side, light, Faint, fuzzy, the suggestion of sky, of wind, of the world that once was, if only they could reach it before the spiral closed again. The crack widened, not by force, but by will. The will of something long thought erased. A rebellion of memory against the machinery of oblivion. Through it, a sliver of sky bled into the endless black. Not the clean blue of safety, not the golden warmth of salvation, but something real. Clouded, gray, heavy with the weight of the world, still waiting beyond this nightmare. But real, undeniably real. Sister Mary tightened her grip. Her bones ached. Her muscles felt like shredded threads, but she refused to let go. The children, their faces half light, half shadow, turned toward the breach. For the first time since this horror began, their eyes changed. No longer empty, no longer flickering between worlds. There was something behind them now. Something pure, something desperate. Hope, fragile, razor-thin, but alive. The spiral shuddered in fury. It twisted upon itself, mouths folding over mouths, limbs splitting and convulsing, trying to close the breach. A tidal wave of shadow surged forward, a last desperate attempt to reclaim what it believed was already consumed. Tendrils whipped towards Sister Mary and the children, screeching, folding space around themselves, tearing holes in the air. But the breach held. One of the tendrils struck. It wrapped around Sister Mary's leg, yanking with a force that threatened to dislocate her hip, dragging her backward toward the spiral's mouth. Her hands screamed with pain as she refused to release the children. No, her voice wasn't just defiance. It was command. It was the single, primal scream of a soul choosing annihilation over surrender. You will not take them. Not today. Not ever. The light from the breach pulsed once more, and then exploded outward. Not like fire, not like a weapon, like a wave of memory. A force made of every name, every life, every forgotten soul ever swallowed by the gates. Their stories surged forward, crashing into the spiral structure like a hurricane of identity. And the spiral, that engine of forgetting, that cathedral of consumption, fractured. The fracture raced through the spiral's core. Cracks splintered in all directions, splitting its geometry into impossible shards. Mouths screamed. Eyes ruptured into pools of black fire. Limbs tore free from the walls, flailing wildly as the machine of oblivion collapsed under the unbearable weight of everything it had ever tried to erase. A scream echoed, not one voice, but millions, the scream of a prison breaking. The tendril on Sister Mary's leg snapped, recoiling like a severed nerve. She fell forward, dragging the children toward the breach, her knees scraping across the jagged ground that flickered between stone and nothingness. Every muscle felt like fire. Every joint screamed. But she moved. She moved, because the breach was still there, and on the other side was still a world. Broken, imperfect, terrifying, but theirs. The children stumbled with her, their forms stabilizing more with every inch closer. Their shadows thinned. Their bones regained weight. Their cries became real, not echoes, not distortions, but sound. Beautiful, terrible sound. The sound of life fighting to remain itself. Behind them, the spiral collapsed inward, not into destruction, but into itself, like a dying star folding into singularity. Mouths imploded. Eyes snapped shut. Entire sections of the nightmare folded into smooth, crushing blackness, as if the very concept of the spiral was being overwritten, not destroyed, but erased from the possibility of existing again. A final tendril lashed forward, a last desperate grasp, stretching towards Sister Mary's back. It was inches away, closer, closer, when the breach flared, brighter than any star. The tendril evaporated mid-strike, shredded into particles of dust and memory. The light roared forward, pulling Sister Mary and the children through as the spiral folded one final time, collapsing into nothing, leaving behind not ruin, but absence. And then, silence. The silence that followed was not the suffocating kind that had filled the chamber before, not the crushing weight of oblivion, nor the dreadful hum of something waiting to devour. This was clean. Empty, yes, but not dead. The kind of silence that comes after the storm has passed, after something breaks that was never meant to be broken. A silence where breath exists again, where gravity feels familiar, where time returns. Sister Mary collapsed on a solid earth. Real earth. Damp, cold, but whole. Her fingers still locked around the children, whose forms were now fully flesh, fully real. No more flickering. No more shadow. Their small bodies trembled against her as they sobbed, their cries echoing against the sound of wind, real wind. Not the breath of the abyss, not the shriek of something endless, but wind, air moving through trees, whispering through grass, whispering they were back. Above them, the breach, the fracture between worlds, shimmered. A gash of white light against the sky, its edges fraying like torn cloth. Slowly, it began to seal. Threads of light stitching it closed from the edges inward, folding back upon itself, until only a thin scar of brightness remained against the clouds. And then nothing. Gone. As though it had never been there. As though the nightmare had tried, and failed, to fully overwrite the world. Sister Mary's chest heaved. Her eyes burned. Her lips trembled as she stared upward, unable to process whether what she saw was real or hallucination. But then, a sound so achingly ordinary it shattered her. The chirp of a bird. Distant, fragile, laughably small compared to the cacophony of everything that had come before. But it was real, and with it came the undeniable realization. They had made it back. Not unscarred, not untouched, but alive. The children, faces buried in her robe, clung tighter. Their bodies were cold, their skin pale, but their hearts pounded. Real, loud. Here. Sister Mary closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she finally allowed herself to believe it. It was over. The spiral was gone. The gates were closed. Or no, there were no gates left to close. What had once been doors were now voids. Collapsed, folded into nothing. And yet, even as relief tried to bloom within her, something stirred beneath it. A hollow, a chill, not from a world around her, but from the space where the breach had been. A question whispered by the wind. A terrible, gnawing question that refused to die. If the seventh door is gone, what else went with it? For a long time, Sister Mary sat there, knees buried in the dirt, arms wrapped around the children, her head bowed beneath a sky that suddenly felt too wide, too fragile. The clouds rolled above, innocent in their laziness, as though nothing had happened beneath them, as though reality itself hadn't just torn open like wet paper, as though the fabric of existence hadn't frayed to the point of snapping. The ground beneath her vibrated, but not from something rising, not from something lurking. No, this was the aftershock, a soft, residual tremor left behind when the foundation of the universe repairs itself, like a scar beneath skin. Something had tried to rewrite the world. Something had tried to make it forget itself. And though the breach was gone, and the spiral folded into nothing, the world would never be quite the same. Not entirely. In the distance, bells tolled. Real bells. Church bells. The sound rolled over the hills, lazy and imperfect, their tone cracked from rust and age. But they rang. And as their echoes faded into the wind, Sister Mary understood something so painful it nearly buckled her where she sat. No one would believe this. No one could. The world was still turning. People were still waking, eating, laughing, living, completely unaware of how close they had come to being folded into silence forever. And yet, something remained. A mark. A scar in the ground where the spiral had opened. Not a crater. Not a ruin. But a ring. A perfect black ring, burned into the earth like the shadow of something that had stood there, like the memory of something that the world itself now refused to look at. The grass wouldn't grow there. Animals wouldn't step there. The wind refused to cross it. Sister Mary stared at it. Her fingers tightened around the children as a final thought, heavier than the rest, settled like lead in her bones. The gates are gone, but doors can be made again. And somewhere, in the vast, quiet darkness beyond stars, something else watched. Something waiting. And so, as the last threads of that impossible nightmare dissolve into the air, one truth remains. A truth heavier than any horror, more enduring than any fear. The world often carries scars invisible to the eye. Scars of things that brush too close to the edge. Scars of doors that were never supposed to be opened, and yet, someone opened them. Sometimes, those scars fade. Sometimes, they remain as silent warnings, as echoes of the thin, fragile boundary that holds reality together. Sister Mary, kneeling on the cold earth, holding the two trembling children, understood something most of us never will, that there are forces in this world and beyond it that thrive not on being seen, but on being forgotten. Forces that feed on neglect, on silence, on the comfort of pretending that if we cannot see the abyss, then surely it cannot see us. But she knows better now, and maybe, after hearing this, so do you. The ring burned into the earth is not just a stain. It's a reminder that sometimes survival isn't about strength. It isn't about power. It's about remembrance, about refusing to forget who we are, what we fight for, and what we are willing to hold on to when the darkness demands that we let go. Because in the end, it was not light that held the abyss back. It was something far more terrifying to the void itself, the refusal to surrender, the refusal to be erased. And perhaps that is the true warning buried beneath this story. That as long as we remember, as long as we choose to remember, the gates may close, the void may retreat, and the spiral may collapse into silence once more. But the moment we forget, the moment we allow the hum of the ordinary to drown out the whispers of what once was, that is the moment the first hinge turns again. That is when the door starts to open. If this story shook something awake in you, if it left a mark deeper than the surface, then let it stay. Let it breathe. And if you believe that stories like this matter, stay close. There are more truths waiting beneath the surface, more shadows watching. Subscribe to this channel, leave your thoughts below, and share this if you believe that some doors should never be forgotten.